The air inside the Golden Q billiards hall was thick, smelling strongly of expensive cigars and old wood polish. It was a Tuesday night, but in this part of the city, weekdays didn't matter much to the people who frequented this place. The room was dimly lit, with just enough light shining down on the green felt tables to make the colors pop. Laughter echoed off the walls, mixing with the sharp, rhythmic sound of balls cracking against each other. It was a man's world, or at least, a world for people who liked to throw money around like it was confetti. Julian sat at the bar, swirling the ice in his glass. He was a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted, usually before he even finished asking for it. He wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and he had the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. But tonight, Julian was bored. He had already won a few $1,000s playing some amateurs, and the thrill was fading. He wanted something more. He wanted a spectacle. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the tables, looking for someone who might provide a bit of entertainment. That was when he noticed the man sitting in the far corner, away from the main action. The man looked completely out of place. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with a face that looked like a crumpled map of deep lines and wrinkles. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt that had seen better days and dirty work boots. He was just sitting there, quietly sipping a glass of water, watching the games with eyes that seemed to take in everything but gave nothing away. Julian's lips curled into a smile. This was perfect. It was like finding a diamond in a pile of rocks, or in this case, a victim in a room full of predators. He grabbed his drink and swaggered over to the corner table, his expensive shoes clicking loudly on the floor. The older man didn't even look up as Julian approached. He just kept his eyes fixed on a young couple playing pool nearby, missing easy shots and giggling. "Hey, old-timer," Julian said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from the nearest tables. "You look like you've been around a felt table or two in your life." The old man slowly turned his head. His eyes were a piercing gray, surprisingly clear and sharp against his weathered face. He looked at Julian for a long moment, then took a slow sip of his water before speaking. "I've watched a few games," the man said softly. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves skidding across pavement. "Not much of a player myself." Julian laughed, throwing his head back. "Oh, come on now. Don't be modest. Everyone in here likes to think they're the next Minnesota Fats. Why are you hiding in the corner? Bet you've got a trick shot or two up your sleeve." The man shook his head slightly. "Just enjoying the quiet. It's hard to find sometimes." The crowd nearby was starting to watch. They knew Julian's style. They knew that when he cornered someone, the show was about to start. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick roll of cash bound with a rubber band. He thumped it down on the edge of the old man's table. The sound was heavy and solid. "I tell you what," Julian said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the gamble. "I'm bored. I want to play a game, but I want to make it interesting. I'm looking for someone who can play flawlessly. No mistakes. No scratching. No bad shots. Just perfect pool." He peeled off a few bills from the roll, but then, perhaps feeling the need to really impress the room, he reached back into his pocket and pulled out another stack. He kept adding to the pile until there was a mountain of money sitting on the rail. There had to be 150,000 there. "Grand," Julian announced loudly to the room. "I bet you this entire pile of cash that you can't run this table without a single error. If you miss once, if you scratch, if you don't make it look easy, you walk away with nothing. And I get to keep your story?" A murmur went through the crowd. People started moving closer, forming a ring around the table. They looked at the old man with pity. To them, he looked like a homeless person who had wandered in to get out of the cold. They looked at the money with hunger. It seemed insane. Julian wasn't just betting, he was humiliating the man. "What do you say?" Julian asked, leaning over the table, invading the man's personal space. "Are you going to take the money, or are you going to admit you're just a tourist?" The old man looked at the money. He didn't look at it with greed, he looked at it with a strange curiosity, like he was looking at a bug under a microscope. He reached out a hand, trembling slightly, not from fear, Julian thought, but from age. The man brushed his fingers over the edge of the cash. Flawlessly, the man repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "Every shot," Julian confirmed, grinning. He thought he had the old man trapped. He thought the man would either refuse and look like a coward, or accept and lose terribly. Julian didn't care about the money, really. He had millions. He just wanted to break someone. The old man sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to empty his lungs. He placed his glass of water down on the floor very carefully. Then, using the edge of the table to steady himself, he pushed his chair back and stood up. For a second, he looked fragile, like a stiff wind might knock him over. But as he found his balance, something changed in his stance. His shoulders didn't slump anymore. His back straightened. "Okay," the old man said. "I accept." The room erupted in whispers. Julian's grin widened. He clapped his hands together, rubbing them in anticipation. "Great. This is going to be fun. Get the balls," he shouted to a waiter. As the waiter stepped forward to rack the balls, the old man reached down to the floor beside his chair. He picked up a long, black case that Julian hadn't even noticed. It was scuffed and covered in stickers from old state fairs and truck stops. The old man unlatched the case and opened it. Inside, resting in velvet that had turned gray with age, was a pool cue. It was a simple thing, nothing flashy like the custom cues Julian and his friends used. But the wood was polished to a shine that seemed to glow in the dim light. The old man took it out, twisting the two halves together with a practiced ease. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at the money. He just looked at the table. Julian racked the balls himself, tightening the triangle as hard as he could to make the break difficult. He wanted the old man to fail on the very first shot. He placed the white ball on the head string and looked at the old man. "You break," Julian said, waving a hand magnanimously. "Let's see what you've got." The old man walked around the table, chalked the tip of his cue with blue chalk, rubbing it in slow circles. He bent down, lining up the shot. The crowd was silent now, watching to see the first fumble. But as the old man leaned over the table, his hand forming a bridge on the felt that was as steady as a rock, Julian felt a sudden, cold prickle on the back of his neck. The old man didn't look like a tired old man anymore. He looked like a surgeon about to make the first cut. He pulled the cue back, paused for a fraction of a second, and then drove it forward. The noise in the billiards hall died down to a low murmur as the reality of the bet settled over the room. $150,000 was a lot of money, even for a place like this. But the contrast between the two men made it feel like a joke. On one side was Julian, polished, arrogant, and vibrating with energy. On the other was the old man, quiet, worn out, and looking like he should be sitting on a porch somewhere rather than standing in a high-stakes game. Julian stepped forward, putting a hand on the old man's shoulder to stop him from leaning over the table for the break. "Hold on there," Julian said, a wide grin plastered across his face. "We need to get the rules straight before you touch that white ball. I'm not a cheater, and I don't want you saying I tricked you later." The old man straightened up, nodding slowly. "That's fair. What are the terms?" "Simple," Julian said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "If you run the table, meaning you sink every single one of your balls, then the 8 ball, without missing a shot, scratching, or hitting the wrong ball first, the money is yours. But..." He paused for effect, pointing a finger in the air. "If you miss even once, if you scratch, or if you don't make it look easy, the game is over. You walk away with nothing, and I keep my cash." The old man looked at the stack of money on the rail, then back at Julian. "And if I win, you pay me, and we leave." "If you win," Julian laughed, "I will personally hand you that cash, shake your hand, and buy you a drink of whatever you want. But let's be honest, that's not going to happen." The crowd around them chuckled. It seemed impossible. Pool is a game of millimeters, a game where even the best players in the world miss under pressure. To ask an old man in a flannel shirt to play a perfect game was like asking a dog to sing opera. "All right," Julian said, rubbing his hands together. "Now, since I put up the money, I'll break. I want to see what the table looks like before I let you touch it." He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed his fancy custom cue stick from the rack. It was made of shiny maple with inlays that sparkled under the lights. He chalked the tip aggressively, the blue dust flying into the air. He positioned the white ball behind the head string, eyeing the triangle of colored balls at the other end of the table. He wanted to smash them as hard as he could to create a mess. If the balls were scattered awkwardly, it would be even harder for someone to play a perfect game. Julian leaned over and took his stance. He drew the cue back and slammed it forward. Crack! The sound was like a gunshot. The balls exploded in every direction. They slammed into the rails and careened back and forth across the green felt. One striped ball rattled in a pocket but didn't drop. Another spun wildly across the table. When the noise finally stopped, the table was a disaster zone. The balls were clustered in strange groups. Some were frozen together against the rails. Others were sitting in the middle of the table, blocking each other. There was no clear shot. It was a nightmare layout. Julian stood up and shrugged, looking at the old man. "Well, that's pool, right? Sometimes the table gives you a break, sometimes it doesn't. Your turn." He tossed his cue onto a nearby chair and motioned for the old man to step up. "Good luck. You're going to need a miracle to run this table." The old man didn't say a word. He didn't complain about the break, and he didn't look at the mess with fear. He just walked around the table once, slowly, like he was reading a book. He stopped at one spot, bent down to look at an angle, and then walked to the other side. The crowd watched him, whispering among themselves. They thought he was stalling, too scared to take the first shot. But the old man wasn't stalling. He was calculating. In his mind, the messy table wasn't chaos. It was a puzzle, and he was seeing the lines that connected the pieces. He stopped at the head of the table and picked up his battered cue case again. He pulled out a small piece of sandpaper and lightly roughed up the tip of his stick. Then, he rubbed some chalk onto it, twisting the cue gently. His movements were deliberate and precise, lacking the flashy aggression Julian had shown. He walked to the table and sized up the first ball, a solid yellow sitting near the side pocket. It wasn't an easy shot. It was trapped behind two other balls, leaving only a razor-thin path to the pocket. Julian leaned against a pole, crossing his arms. "Go ahead. Take your time. No rush on my account." The old man ignored him. He bent down, his body folding over the table with a grace that didn't match his age. He rested his hand on the felt, his fingers splayed out to form a rock-solid bridge for the cue. He lowered his head, his chin nearly touching the stick, sighting down the shaft like a soldier aiming a rifle. For 10 seconds, he didn't move. He didn't breathe. The silence in the room grew heavy. People stopped sipping their drinks. The clinking of glasses stopped. Everyone was staring at the old man's back, waiting to see him fail. Then, his arm moved. It was a smooth, piston-like motion. The cue struck the white ball, which in turn struck the yellow ball with a soft click. The yellow ball rolled smoothly across the table, dropped into the pocket, and disappeared. "One," a voice in the crowd whispered. But the real magic was where the white ball went. Instead of rolling wildly or getting trapped behind another ball, it stopped dead. It was sitting perfectly in the center of the table, right in line with the next target. Julian raised an eyebrow. "Lucky shot," he muttered to himself. The old straightened up, walked to the other side of the table, and lined up the next shot. It was a blue ball, sitting near a corner. Again, the angle was tight. Again, he bent down, froze like a statue, and stroked the cue. Click. The blue ball fell. Again, the white ball stopped exactly where it needed to be. The crowd's murmurs changed. They weren't laughing anymore. They were watching. The old man wasn't shaking. His hands weren't trembling. He moved around the table with a quiet efficiency that was terrifying. There was no wasted motion. He didn't celebrate when a ball went in. He didn't cheer. He just moved to the next shot. Julian uncrossed his arms. He stopped leaning against the pole and took a step closer to the table. He watched as the old man cleared 3 more balls in rapid succession. They were difficult shots, too. Balls that were hugging the rail, balls that required spin to get around obstacles. The old man was using spin. He was putting English on the ball, making it dance and curve in ways that defied the laws of physics. The arrogance was draining out of Julian's face. He looked at the money on the rail, then back at the old man. The pile of cash didn't look like a sure thing anymore. It looked like it might actually belong to someone else. He watched the old man's eyes. They were focused, intense, and young again. It was as if the years were falling off him with every ball he sank. Julian realized, with a sudden drop in his stomach, that the old man hadn't even broken a sweat yet. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet, it was heavy. It pressed down on everyone's shoulders like a physical weight. The only sounds that broke the stillness were the sharp click of the cue stick hitting the white ball and the soft thud of balls dropping into the pockets. It was a rhythm, steady and hypnotic, like a metronome ticking away the seconds of Julian's confidence. Julian stood with his hands in his pockets, his fingers fidgeting with his car keys. He wasn't smiling anymore. The smirk had been wiped off his face, replaced by a look of intense focus that bordered on worry. He watched the old man's back as he moved from one shot to the next. The old man's movements were fluid. He didn't walk around the table, he glided. He didn't shuffle his feet, he stepped with purpose. On the table, the situation was getting tricky. Julian's break had left a nasty cluster of balls in the center. They were frozen together, touching, making it impossible to hit one without moving the others in a way that could mess up the shot. This was the part of the game where luck usually ran out. This was where mistakes happened. The old man approached the cluster. He leaned down and looked at it from one side, then walked to the other side and looked again. The crowd held its breath. A young man near the bar whispered, "He's trapped. There's no way out of that without scratching." Julian heard the whisper and felt a small surge of hope. "Yeah," he said, his voice sounding a little too loud in the quiet room. "Looks like you're in a bit of a bind there, friend. Maybe we call it a draw. You played a good game so far." The old man didn't even look up. He acted as if Julian wasn't there. He chalked his cue, the blue dust coating the tip evenly. He leaned over the table, sighting the angle. He wasn't aiming to pot a ball directly. He was aiming to hit the edge of the cluster just right, to split the balls apart like a ripe watermelon. He stroked the cue. It wasn't a hard hit, it was a firm, controlled tap. The white ball hit the cluster. There was a flurry of motion as the colored balls rolled apart. They didn't scatter wildly, they rolled open like curtains on a window, revealing clear paths to the pockets. And the white ball, it stopped dead in the center of the chaos, waiting for the next shot. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a shot that required a delicate touch, a feel for the felt that most players spent a lifetime trying to learn and never quite mastered. "Nice touch," Julian muttered, gritting his teeth. "But can you finish it?" The old man proceeded to clear 3 more balls in quick succession. Each shot was cleaner than the last. He cut a red ball into the side pocket so thinly that it looked like it missed, but the rail embraced it and dropped it down. He drew the white ball back long distances, avoiding scratches with millimeters to spare. Julian was starting to sweat. He took his hands out of his pockets and wiped them on his pants. He looked at the stack of money on the rail. $150,000. It was sitting right there. 10 minutes ago, he felt like it was already his. Now, it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He needed to do something. He needed to break the old man's rhythm. "Hey!" Julian barked as the old man was lining up the next shot. "How long have you been playing? You're not just some lucky guy off the street, are you?" The old man froze. He stayed in his bent-over position for a moment, then slowly stood up. He looked at Julian, and for the first time, there was a flicker of emotion in those gray eyes. It wasn't anger. It was annoyance. "Does it matter?" the old man asked quietly. "It matters," Julian snapped, stepping closer to the table, invading the personal space around the felt. "Because I don't like being hustled. If you're a pro, you should have said so. We're gentlemen here." The crowd shifted uneasily. The word hustled hung in the air. In the pool world, that was a dangerous accusation. "I am just a man playing a game," the old man said. He turned his back on Julian and bent down to the table again. "You made the terms. You set the price." He hit the shot. The ball dropped. Julian felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. He was losing control of the room. He walked around the table, trying to catch the old man's eye, trying to distract him. He waved his hand near the pocket. He coughed loudly. He even kicked the leg of his chair, making a screeching noise on the floor. But nothing worked. The old man was in a bubble. It was as if he had stepped into a different world where only he, the cue, and the balls existed. The noises of the bar, the smoke, the lights, they all faded away for him. He was playing a different game than everyone else. They were playing pool, he was performing surgery. There were only 4 balls left on the table now. The game was almost over. Julian's heart was hammering against his ribs. He looked at the faces of the people watching. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the old man with awe. Some had their mouths open. Others were nodding slowly, recognizing the skill they were witnessing. Julian realized with a sinking feeling that even if he won the money on some technicality, he had already lost the respect of the room. The old man lined up a long shot down the table. It was a straight shot, but the distance made it dangerous. Any tiny wobble, any imperfection in the felt, and the ball could wobble off course. The pressure of the money, the crowd, and Julian's staring eyes would make any amateur's hand shake. The old man's hand was steady as a stone. He pulled the cue back, paused, and sent it forward. Tick. The white ball traveled the length of the table, struck the object ball perfectly in the center, and sent it straight into the pocket. The white ball followed for a second, then grabbed the felt and spun to a stop, just inches from the pocket's edge. It was a safety shot, perfectly executed, though he didn't need safety. He was in control. Julian slumped back against the bar. He ordered a whiskey, downing it in one gulp. The burn didn't help. He watched the old man line up the next shot, a striped green ball hugging the rail. This was the kind of shot that gave people nightmares. You had to hit the rail and the ball at the same time, or the ball would rattle and refuse to fall. The old man bent low. His bridge hand was elevated, his fingers lifting the cue slightly to strike downward on the ball. It was a technique used by old school players, a technique you didn't see much anymore. He hit the ball. It hit the rail, kissed the green ball, and dropped softly into the corner. It was undeniable now. Julian wasn't playing a tourist. He wasn't playing a retired grandfather. He was challenging a man who had forgotten more about pool than Julian would ever know. The 150,000 was the least of Julian's worries now. He was staring at a master, and he had just foolishly woken him up. The green felt of the pool table looked less like a game board now and more like a minefield. The easy shots were gone, swallowed by the pockets in the first few minutes. What remained were the nightmares, the balls that were frozen together, the ones sitting inches from the rails, and the obstacles that blocked every clear path to the pockets. This was the part of the game where luck usually ran out, where the pressure made the hand shake and the eye miss the mark by a fraction of an inch. Julian stood rigid by the side of the table, the color draining from his face. The 150,000 sitting on the rail wasn't just a pile of cash anymore, it was a noose around his neck, tightening with every clack of the balls. He watched the old man with a mix of terror and fascination. The arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, sweat-inducing realization. This wasn't a joke. The old man wasn't a tourist. He was a surgeon, and he was dissecting the table. The old man stood at the head of the table, staring down a long, impossible angle. There was no direct shot at the yellow ball. It was tucked behind a solid red ball, hiding like a scared child. To a normal player, this was a safety shot, a time to play defense and put the ball back somewhere difficult. But the old man didn't play defense. He leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the geometry of the felt. He hit the cue ball softly, but with a sharp, spinning motion. The white ball didn't travel in a straight line. It curved as it rolled, snaking around the red obstacle like a river or rock. It kissed the yellow ball on the edge, sending it rolling lazily toward the corner pocket. It looked like it was going to miss, but at the very last second, gravity took over, and it dropped. "Did you see that?" someone whispered loudly in the back. "He swerved it?" Julian swallowed hard. He slammed his hand on the table, trying to break the old man's focus. That's a fluke. You can't do that twice. The old man didn't blink. He didn't look at Julian. He just moved to the next shot. He was in a trance, a zone of absolute concentration where the outside world didn't exist. The noise of the bar, the clinking glasses, the hum of the refrigerator, it all fell away. There was only the table, the stick, and the shot. The next ball was the worst of the bunch. It was a blue ball frozen against the rail, with the cue ball stuck on the other side of the table. To hit it, the old man had to hit the rail first, hoping the angle would bounce the ball true. It was a 3-rail bank shot, a move that was considered high risk even for professionals. One wrong calculation, one piece of dust on the ball, and it would miss by a mile. The old man chalked his cue again, the blue dust coating the tip. He bent down, his face inches from the felt. He lined up the cue stick not with the object ball, but with a spot on the cushion 3 feet away. He was seeing lines that nobody else could see. He stroked the cue. Click. The white ball hit the first rail, then the second, then the third. It raced across the table with a lazy speed, exactly as planned. It struck the blue ball, which popped off the rail and rolled into the opposite pocket. It was a thing of beauty, a display of physics that felt like magic. The crowd let out a breath they didn't know they were holding. A few people actually clapped, quickly stopping themselves when they remembered the high tension of the moment. Julian ran a hand through his hair, messing up his perfect styling. He looked at the door, then back at the table. He was trapped. "Who are you?" Julian whispered, half to himself, half to the old man. "You aren't some nobody." The old man didn't answer. He was lining up the next shot. This one required a delicate touch. The object ball was just inches away from the pocket, but the cue ball was positioned in a way that if he hit it too hard, the white ball would follow it in a scratch. If he scratched, he lost the game. He needed to stop the white ball dead in its tracks after hitting the target. It required a draw shot, hitting the ball low to make it spin backward upon impact. It was the hardest shot in pool to control. The old man's hand was steady. His wrist was loose. He tapped the cue ball. It rolled forward, struck the colored ball gently, and sent it into the pocket. Then, like an obedient dog returning to its master, the white ball spun backward, grabbed the felt, and stopped exactly 1 inch from the lip of the pocket. Safe. Julian felt his knees go weak. He grabbed the edge of the bar to steady himself. He looked around the room. The faces of the crowd had changed completely. The mockery was gone. The smiles were gone. They were watching a master at work, and they knew it. The man in the flannel shirt wasn't a bum anymore, the disguise had fallen away. He stood tall, his movements efficient and precise. There was a dignity about him now, a commanding presence that demanded respect. There was only 1 ball left before the 8 ball, a tricky green ball sitting in the middle of a cluster. The old man used a split shot, hitting the edge of the cluster to send the green ball out while leaving the white ball safely behind. It was a chess move, not just a pool shot. As the green ball dropped, the room fell into a tomb-like silence. The 8 ball sat alone on the table, like a dark king waiting to be captured. It was the final test. The money was on the line. Julian's pride was on the line. The old man had played a perfect game so far, but one mistake now, and it was all for nothing. Julian stared at the old man, really seeing him for the first time. He noticed the calluses on the old man's fingers, proof of decades holding a cue. He noticed the way his eyes tracked the imaginary lines on the table with the precision of a hawk. Julian realized he hadn't just challenged a random old man in a bar. He had challenged a ghost from the past, someone who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of angles and spin, someone who had likely forgotten more about pool than Julian would ever learn. The old man walked around the table one last time. He didn't look like a tired grandfather anymore. He looked like a warrior before the final strike. The air in the room felt electric. Every pair of eyes was glued to the dark sphere sitting in the shadows of the corner pocket. The 150,000 sat waiting, a silent witness to the greatest game anyone in that hall had ever seen. Julian closed his eyes for a second, praying for a miss, praying for a miracle. But when he opened them, looking at the calm, still figure standing over the table, he knew. There would be no miracle. There would only be the inevitable end, played out by a man who was a true master of the game. The 8-ball sat alone in the shadows of the corner pocket, looking less like a piece of plastic and more like a judge waiting to deliver a final verdict. It was the last obstacle standing between the old man and the 150,000. The distance from the cue ball wasn't terrible, but the angle was sharp. He had to hit the rail first, a thin-cut shot that required perfect speed. Too hard, and the ball would bounce out of the pocket. Too soft, and it would wobble on the lip. It was a shot that could ruin a professional career, let alone a friendly bet. Julian stood frozen, his glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. His mouth was dry, and his heart was beating so hard he could feel it thumping against his ribs. 10 minutes ago, he was thinking about what kind of car he would buy with his winnings. Now, he was just praying the old man would miss so he could keep his dignity. He looked around the room. No one was talking. No one was drinking. Every single person in the golden queue was leaning forward, their eyes locked on the table. The air was so thick you could choke on it. The old man didn't rush. He treated the final shot exactly the same way he had treated the first one. He walked around the table, checked the angle from both sides, and wiped the shaft of his cue with a clean cloth. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, his chest rising and falling in a controlled rhythm. He wasn't shaking. In fact, he looked calmer than he had when he walked in. He leaned over the table, forming his bridge hand. His fingers were old and knotted with arthritis, but when they pressed against the felt, they were as solid as rock. He lowered his head, his left eye squinting slightly as he lined up the cue ball with the ghost spot on the rail he needed to hit. For what felt like an eternity, he was frozen. The only movement in the room came from the dust motes dancing in the light above the table. Julian held his breath without realizing it. The silence was absolute. Then, the old man stroked the cue. It was a smooth, fluid motion, not too fast, not too slow. The tip of the cue struck the white ball with a dull click. The white ball traveled across the green felt, hit the rail with a soft kiss, and caromed toward the corner. The 8-ball seemed to hang in the air for a split second before rolling toward the pocket. It dropped cleanly, without a sound, falling into the dark hole. But the game wasn't over. The white ball was spinning backward, drifting dangerously close to the same pocket. If it fell in, it was a scratch, and the old man would lose on a technicality. Every eye in the room shifted to the white ball. It teetered on the edge of the pocket, defying gravity for a heartbeat, before the friction of the felt grabbed it. It stopped. Dead center. 1 inch away from disaster. The old man stood up straight. He didn't cheer. He didn't pump his fist. He simply exhaled and looked at the table. It was a perfect run. Flawless. For 3 seconds, There was total silence. Then, the room exploded. People rushed the table, shouting and clapping. Julian stood there, stunned, his drink splashing onto his expensive shoes. He watched as the old man calmly took the cue apart, screwing the two halves together and placing them back into the battered case. The noise of the crowd seemed to wash over him without touching him. He felt hollowed out. He had been arrogant, he had been cruel, and he had been completely destroyed by a man he had insulted. Julian pushed his way through the crowd to reach the table. He saw the stack of money still sitting on the rail. He reached out and scooped it up. It felt heavy in his hands, much heavier than it had when he put it there. He walked over to where the old man was closing his case. "Here," Julian said, his voice cracking slightly. He held out the money. "You won. Every cent. It's yours." The old man looked at the money, then up at Julian. His gray eyes were soft now, lacking the intense laser focus they had during the game. He reached out and took the stack. His hands were rough and warm. "Thank you," the old man said simply. He didn't count it. He didn't gloat, he just put the money into his old canvas bag. "Who are you?" Julian asked, unable to stop himself. He sounded desperate now. "I mean, really. You're not just some guy. I've played pros, and they aren't as good as you. You could be on tour. You could be a millionaire." The old man smiled, a small, tired expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I played a long time ago," he said. "Back when the game was about the table, not the cameras. I made my money, and I lost my money. I made enemies and I made friends. But I stopped playing for people like you a long time ago. People who don't respect the wood." "I disrespected you," Julian admitted, looking down at his shoes. "I'm sorry. I thought I was better than you." "We all think that," the old man said softly. "Until the table teaches us otherwise." He zipped up his case and picked up his bag. "Wait," Julian said. "Let me buy you a drink. The best bottle they have. Please." The old man shook his head. "No, thank you. I have a long drive home, and I've had enough excitement for one night." He turned to leave. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. They didn't look at him with pity anymore, they looked at him with reverence. As he walked toward the door, a man who had been sitting in the shadows, the house manager, a guy who had been running pool halls for 40 years, stepped forward. He looked at Julian, who was standing by the table looking defeated. "Do you know who that was?" the manager asked Julian. Julian shook his head. "No. Just a master." "That was Elias," the manager said, his voice full of awe. "They called him the Ghost 30 years ago. He won the world championship in '78 and then vanished. Nobody knew where he went. They say he never lost a match he cared about. You just challenged a legend, son, and for some reason, he decided to show up." Julian looked toward the door just as it swung closed. The old man was gone. The bell above the door stopped ringing. Julian was left standing in the middle of the loud, smoky bar, holding nothing but an empty glass and a lesson he would never forget. He walked over to the table and ran his hand over the green felt. It felt smooth and cool. He realized that in his quest for money and status, he had forgotten the beauty of the game. He had forgotten that there were people in this world who possessed a quiet kind of magic that money couldn't buy. Julian signaled the bartender. "A round for the house," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "On me." As the crowd cheered and the bartender began pouring drinks, Julian looked at the empty corner where the old man had sat. He felt humbled, but in a strange way, he also felt lucky. He had lost 150,000, but he had witnessed perfection. And as he took a sip of his drink, he realized that was a memory worth more than any stack of cash.